So today for our conference on global connectedness, I wanted to focus on my research about digital nomads. And so in this presentation, I'm just going to overview some of the specific definitions and concepts and just highlight some of the topics that I've touched on. So I first began to research digital nomads in the year 2017. That was one of the peak years for popularity for this topic, as measured in how much attention it was getting in the news cycle. I did end up publishing one book and about 6 or 7 academic journal articles and chapters on the topic. So in this presentation, I just want to define some of the primary concepts, social facts, and current topics that are being explored in this subcultural lifestyle. And so in 1997, there was a book called Digital Nomads published by Manners and Makimoto, and this was at the dawn of the internet. And so this was an essay book about speculating on the social changes that would be made possible by this new thing called the internet. And so in Digital Nomad, they talked about how people that do most of their work based on using computers would therefore be free from location-based employment, and therefore they could be doing their work on a beach. And of course, he imagined this white male manager on a beach with his secretary back in the office, and he was calling into her and asking her to do various things. They did realize, the authors, that there was a distinction between the ability to work remotely, facilitated by computers, versus people basically working in the service industry who would still be tethered to their jobs. And so firstly, I wanted to talk about the demographics of who digital nomads are. And so you'll remember I started this research in 2017, and so I was specifically talking about the millennial generation when they were in their mid to late 20s and early 30s. And this was the primary age group that my participants fell into. I had found these folks by attending workshops on digital nomad conferences, lifestyles, and people were involved in the lifestyle. They themselves identified as digital nomads. These were primarily nearly all people from rich Western countries who had very strong passports when measured globally. And indeed, some of them even had 2 passports. You know, UK and Australia was a common pairing. They were overwhelmingly college graduates. The one who had not gone to college had a 6-figure job at the time. These folks were 50% single, 50% partnered. Very few married, however, and equal numbers were actively getting a divorce. None of them had children, and all of them had been raised by parents that were professional, that were middle class. They were raised with a sense of entitlement, that if they went to college and did the right things, that they would achieve a lifestyle equal to that of their parents. And so this specific generation really represents a downward mobility. And that, I think, is at the key heart of the digital nomad lifestyle, is that these were folks that were overpromised a lifestyle based on the levels achieved by their parents. They are not going to achieve that, and so they seek this excitement and fulfillment elsewhere. Yeah, so downward mobility is a key factor of this lifestyle trend, because they're basically outsourcing the American dream then to a country in which they can live at that level that they were promised, that their parents had achieved, but it's no longer accessible to them. They can no longer afford to live in their home countries at this level, you know, and so they need to then move to Thailand to achieve this level of the American dream. And so I also wanted to put this study into the global context of migration, because of course the vast majority of people in the globe are facing issues of forced migration, and so they're fleeing, you know, war and social unrest and extreme violence, environmental catastrophes, and so on. And so the vast majority of folks are being pushed out of their places. But digital nomads are from wealthy countries, the countries to which many global refugees are fleeing to. and they find that they cannot afford the life in their own home countries now, and so they're actually going to developing countries to be able to afford that lifestyle. One of the key sayings that is often mentioned in digital nomad circles is that anyone can be a digital nomad. They just need to want it hard enough. And that's just very blind and offensive, because you certainly have to have a passport that can allow you access to global travel. And you have to be at that professional development level where you're not working in a grueling service industry or manual labor employment, that you have employment that is based on computer work, office work. And so it just shows and demonstrates this blind spot that digital nomads have towards the global social context, and that indeed demographics do matter as you're positioned globally in the social hierarchy. And so when digital nomads arrive in places like Chiang Mai, Thailand, especially if they often follow the tourist pathways, and so they go to places where they can really be treated well as tourists, where they can access English language, and where they can really have these kind of luxurious Western style accommodations. They often live in groups of other digital nomads such as themselves. So even though they think of themselves as global citizens who are really world savvy and learning about cultures and stuff, they tend to live in tourist areas and congregate and live in like boutique hotels or Airbnbs with other people just like them. And so they don't integrate into the local communities, and they don't really learn how to engage with local communities. But as their numbers grow in these particular locations, and I mentioned Chiang Mai, Thailand, because that's the ground zero for digital nomads, that they raise the prices, and that really affects the local people. So there's great displacement of local people and who face inflation because of these outsiders coming in. We've definitely seen a global movement that fights against tourism and over tourism, the saturation of too many tourists going to one particular location. And so there have been many protests in heavy tourist destinations such as Italy, such as Barcelona, Spain, and so on. And so digital nomads are part of the pressure that's being placed on these locations. One of the topics that I'm really interested in my research is on sustainable tourism. However, I just don't see that tourism in itself is sustainable, especially the moment that anyone steps on an airplane, it really blows it, because even just one air flight can equal the equivalent carbon pollution as someone becoming a vegetarian for an entire year. And so that's why it's great that this conference is virtual and that none of us flew anywhere to present our topics, and we did save that carbon impact on the world. You know, what kind of jobs do these digital nomads have? It's very bifurcated, because certainly people could have a full-time tech job with a big salary that would go very far in Thailand. But for those people, those jobs didn't last long. Perhaps they lasted 1, 2, 3 years, but ultimately they lost those full-time jobs with their benefits and became freelancers and were making half of the money. And so the majority of the people I spoke to were women and younger, and so they were not established in their careers. A lot of them started their remote work even after they jumped into this lifestyle. So it was extremely precarious, but ultimately people were doing basically online gig work, such as, you know, designing a website for someone or writing piecemeal web articles at, you know, $10, $20 a pop. So they're just earning these little micro amounts of money per gig instead of working for a company and actually having a salary. So they were extremely precarious. Some were working as pet sitters, and so they were basically making between $1,000 to $2,000 a month. And some people had, a few people, like less than 20% had full-time jobs where they were making a full salary, but the vast majority were doing these gig work positions, and so they had very little money, and so they were very much living paycheck to paycheck. One of the things that stuck out to me is they never really immersed themselves in the local culture or the local language. They really forced this English only kind of perspective. They think that that's the global dominant language, and that they're just too lazy to really show the respect to the local people by learning just something of the local culture and local language. They could indeed live in a place for quite an extended period of time without learning anything about the language and culture. Their social lives were also remote, so they're talking to their family and friends back home via Zoom. They're perhaps dating in the local area through dating apps. But it is a very technologically mediated social life that they have because they're constantly traveling. So perhaps they do join up with their other digital nomad friends in certain locations, but many times they don't. And so ultimately this was a very lonely lifestyle. And so definitely everyone talked about that during the interview, but you don't see that aspect of it on the social media place. And so many of them were having a lot of mental health issues based out of loneliness and anxiety. And ultimately I felt that this lifestyle was temporary because something ultimately is going to intersect with their life that brings them home. They need to come and participate in family caretaking activities or something like that. They get a job that wants them in the office. They get a relationship and a partner that wants to settle down in a particular location. So something ultimately is going to really ground them, and it was very few digital nomads, and I do know a few who are still traveling even 10 years later. And of course these are people that are very isolated, they don't have full-time partners, they don't have children, they're actively fighting with their family members, the ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head. So it is a very kind of isolated lifestyle, and those who thrive in it are people that really can take that. So thank you so much, and definitely check out, I have a lot more videos on my research topics of digital nomads, and of course I can send my academic work to folks, if you email me and if you're interested in reading more of my research. Thank you.